So welcome to today's Tech Hour. It's Thursday, the 28th of April, 2022, and I'm pleased to have David Farmer, Kelly Johnson, Philip Helbig with me today. And there's two topics on the agenda. The one is ConTeXt and LaTeX. Why shouldn't they do more together? And then Philip has got a special interest in running an up-to-date LaTeX on the VMS machines he has, and that's something which Nelson Beebe, who's usually here but can't be here today, is going to be more expert than any of us. So we'll have to make the best with that. And I suggest we start with the question from Stack Overflow about ConTeXt and LaTeX. And the gist of the question is why are LaTeX and ConTeXt not doing more together?
Just very briefly, could you explain in an executive summary what ConTeXt is? I've heard of it, but I don't know anything about it.
Okay, I'll give an explanation, then David might be able to add to it. So perhaps I should start with what LaTeX is. So LaTeX is the dominant tech package, particularly in academia, in STEM academia, and it developed out of Leslie Lamport's LaTeX. I'm saying this for the benefit of the video audience. And it achieved version 2E in the mid-90s. So previously it was developed by Leslie Lamport, who then passed it over to Frank Mittelbach and his team with the understanding that they would take over the maintenance, and then produced a version called LaTeX 3. Depending on how you count things, we're either still at LaTeX 2E or we've already got to LaTeX 3, and I'm never quite clear about that. The ConTeXt is set up by Hans Hagen, who is a typesetter in Holland, and the Dutch language is sort of somewhat special, and it's big enough to support typesetting, but it's not so large that a small person can't manage in it. So I suspect that he's quite a significant player in Dutch typesetting in particular areas. And his focus is much more on the needs of, one might say, commercial typesetting for books, catalogs, I don't know what else. I don't know exactly what his business is, but he's very much focused, I think, on somebody comes in and say, can you typeset this for me? And the particular prompting of the post to tech.stack exchange was that LaTeX is doing work to introduce an enhanced tagged PDF. And it seems to be working hard to accomplish things that ConTeXt has already achieved. So I'll stop at that point and ask David if he'd like to contribute to this also.
So I became aware of this question being posted because I guess I get email, what comes along Tech Stack Exchange, and this one was at the top, so I looked at it. And then I noticed you posted it as a topic for this discussion this week, so that's why I came. And well, I think you've explained the main point. And like, so we had tech, and tech is about typesetting. Okay, I don't think anybody would deny that that's the main point of tech. And then LaTeX was supposed to be about document preparation, and it was supposed to separate content from presentation. In practice, it doesn't, because that's not how people use it. And so if anything, ConTeXt is a step back towards tech. It's about typesetting, and what, if anything, LaTeX, I think, should be moving in the capture the content and not worry about typesetting, make it easier for people to do that. I'm not optimistic that's going to happen, but in any case, having ConTeXt influence LaTeX would be detrimental to LaTeX. So it's good they're not working together. And it's fine that some people need typesetting, but your average LaTeX author has no business thinking about typesetting, and you end up with lots of bad documents because people who shouldn't be thinking about presentation are thinking about presentation.
Yeah, what seems to happen is that a LaTeX user wants to produce something that looks nice, and it might be a brochure or I mean, I did something for a memorial service, for example. And at that point, it sort of starts to get a bit difficult because you don't have the page maker control over layout, and you end up trying to fake it. Perhaps you should mention something about PreTeXt, because that's the other interest you have, David, which has got a very strong accessibility aspect to it. So perhaps you, for the people who aren't here, could you introduce PreTeXt a little bit and talk about the accessibility that it provides?
Well, PreTeXt is a markup language that really does separate content from presentation. And it's primarily used to write textbooks. And that's because it has a fairly steep learning curve. But once you learn it, it has great features. Okay, accessibility is one of them. Another is that it outputs to almost any format you want. PDF, LaTeX, Epub, HTML, Jupyter, Braille. Because it separates presentation from content, it's able to convert to many different formats. We're working on making it easier to use so that it can be used for shorter documents than a whole textbook, like a handout for class. It's never going to be usable to write a brochure. It's because you can't write a brochure only caring about content. I think you can write a research paper in math or another science without caring about presentation, only caring about content. And so that's really an audience we want to go for PreTeXt. But the separation of content from presentation is what enables accessibility. It's what prohibits you using PreTeXt to write a wedding invitation or a menu for your restaurant or a brochure. And yes, people, including me, do use LaTeX for that, but that's really the wrong tool. And it's because I don't know how to use PageMaker or whatever the current Adobe product is that is designed for that.
I wonder, Kelly, before we do that, I'm very impressed that PreTeXt produces Braille output, which strikes me as being difficult, but also for some people extremely valuable. And I wonder if you'd like to add some supplementary remarks on that.
So to convert a document to Braille, there's 3 or 4 pieces of it to think about. One is just running text, what they call literary text. That's actually not that difficult to just change, alphabetic words into Braille. It's not totally trivial because there's like contractions and it's not word letter for letter, but there's tools that do that. You also need the overall structure so that headings, it's like there's no such thing as large words in Braille, and there's no bold words in Braille. Everything's the same size because it has to fit under your finger. So you need to have the structure laid out well. Mathematics, there's something called Nemeth Braille, which not unlike TeX or LaTeX, there's a begin math mode and an end math mode thing, meaning begin Nemeth Braille. And there's all the same characters are reused to do math. Not infrequently, you need 2 Braille characters to be one symbol. again, there's tools that do that. They're not perfect, but people working on PreTeXt and others are making them better. And then there's diagrams, and diagrams are very complicated. We're actually having a workshop in July about making better diagrams. So an embosser, a thing that makes braille. So it's on these thick sheets of paper this big, and braille dots are 1/10 of an inch apart. And so they do this tricky thing where they print on both sides, they emboss from both sides. So the embosser has a resolution of 1/20th of an inch. So you need to make a diagram at 20 dots per inch. That's the resolution you're allowed. And things like, okay, very simple case. You have an axis and you want to put an O labeling the origin. Okay, well, a vertical line of dots for one axis, vertical line, horizontal line for the other. But then if you don't, the letter O is big in braille compared to in print. So you have to move it. So if your source merely says, draw this line, draw that line, put an O there, you're going to have a collision because your braille symbols cell is going to overlap the lines. On the other hand, if it said, draw this line, and then from this point, move northeast a certain amount and then put the letter O, well, that's something that's really useful because the letters are bigger, so you can just move further in the northeast direction, and now your O is not overlapping things. So one of the many things we're thinking about is how to have a description of a graphical object described in a way that when you multiply the font size by 5, things move in the correct direction and they're still labeling what they want. Anyhow, so there's a workshop in July about that. If anyone's interested, they should contact me.
I wonder if Kelly could tell us something about the report she creates and the adventures she's had with Tag PDF, or successes.
Yeah, sure. So we produce 400 plus page documents that have to be accessible, and because they're posted to the web, but they have to be a PDF because that's what management uses, and to document things and archive them for historical purposes. And in that, we were able to use our Markdown and LaTeX and Pandoc to create slightly accessible documents. They're not fully accessible, but it's a step in the correct direction, I believe. And it was pretty hard when none of the people that were doing it had a disability regarding their site. So we weren't sure if what we were doing was helpful, and then joining this group helped. And then also working with Jonathan Godfrey, statistics professor. Is he from Australia or New Zealand? I can never remember, but.
Are you from Canada or America? I can't remember. He's from New Zealand.
New Zealand.
Canada is a proper subset of America.
And so he's working to, because I use R a lot, and he's working on a project to try to get the alternative text to be automated. So if you have a smooth line, how do you use statistical properties of that line to describe what the line is? And that way, the people with accessibility issues can have access to the same information in an automated process. And so that's one thing that we're looking forward to. And then we're also looking forward to the LaTeX kernel and the advancement that they've just made in making things available that before we had to do behind the scenes. And behind the scenes, the Lua LaTeX filters, those were super helpful for us in trying to create accessible documents, because we were able to use the XML structure behind the scenes when there was a table to just bracket the whole table as a table, which wasn't a feature that was available yet. So we could try to use some of the markdown structure to like pre-tag things basically, so that we didn't have to do it manually.
So the LaTeX, it comes out of Hans Hagen. It comes out of the ConTeXt stable. You mentioned we have to produce reports. Could you be a little bit proud and say who you are?
Yeah, sure. I work for the U.S. federal government in the Department of Commerce and inside NOAA. And we write, mainly I work on groundfish. And so we produce reports based off of the results of statistical models that model the population dynamics of fish. And then managers use the predictions that we have to set catch limits for some of the biggest fisheries off the US West Coast.
And NOAA isn't the man who built the boat for the flood. It's the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration.
Until I heard it on the Tech Hour, I had always assumed it was pronounced NOAA and not NOAA. Do people actually pronounce it NOAA? Everyone?
Yes, it's ubiquitous.
But it's the CIA and not CIA. It's FBI and not BI, right?
And I work for AIM, not AIM.
And I'm also in the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is a part of NOAA, and that's pronounced NIMS.
Okay, we're learning all sorts of things here. And let me say something, so to speak, on behalf of Jonathan Godfrey, which is Braille is useful if you've got it, because it's very helpful when you're proofreading to check that something's right. And it's also important when you're checking, when there's an error in your code, Braille seems to give you a better feel for, sorry, I just used that word, a better feel for what's going on than speech. So the people that know Braille find it very useful. And I'm also thinking of Jeff Batchton, who works at the Open University as a disability officer. And he would, I was at a meeting where he was presenting, and he would use the Braille keyboard, the Braille display, the Braille display to read his notes as he was talking. And if you try to get it through your ears as you're talking, that's such a cognitive dissonance, I don't suppose it works. So Braille is important. It's not a completely second-class thing. Although to what degree it remains important, I don't know. I'm not an expert.
Can people read Braille faster than a speech reader can read a document to them? Because I know that's one limitation that I wasn't aware of. Like, people that are using these PDF readers get really annoyed when stuff is repeated or quite verbose, because the reader reads to them slower than what a sighted person can read themselves. So it takes them a lot longer to listen to a document than it does for us to read it. But I was wondering, if they use Braille, can they read with their fingers as fast as we can read on paper?
Certainly, some people can. Yeah, I once knew a lawyer who was completely blind, and all of his documents were in Braille, and he could read as fast as I could.
I mean, you can listen to synthesized speech and a screen reader at least as fast as you can read. But okay, if there's math, if there's a big formula, it might take off a bunch of lines. And you can kind of have your fingers in multiple places and try to understand the structure of this big formula in a way that's extremely challenging if you're listening to the formula. And if it's a new subject to you, perhaps impossible to absorb it, just by listening to it. So definitely I've seen blind mathematicians, understanding a big formula because they can mark the beginning and the end with a finger each, and then they can feel different parts of it. So there's really nothing that replaces the equivalent of staring at different parts of the big formula, which you can't do without Braille through brain.
If I can sort of put forward an analogy, you're in a room and the lights are out and you don't remember what the room is like, or you've never been there. So you sort of bump around it, and that's your braille sort of way of looking at it. Or you imagine that there's somebody telling you what you're doing as you go around, and that's the speech way of doing things. Does that make a reasonable analogy, do you think, David?
To me, but I don't trust myself to know.
Okay, so to go back to the to bring something back to the main theme, braille is important. We can't just forget about it.
Okay, so if there, I mean, if the law requires you to provide accommodations to people who are blind, it's obvious speech is not adequate, because there's no way you would consider listening to a math book to be just as good as looking at it. So you can't study math if all you're doing is listening to the math book. So.
I guess the thing I get with braille is that you have that reading is more active than listening, if you like. It's certainly more physical than listening. I think I'm trying to get clarity when we can't get clarity from the people we have here, because none of us can read braille. We don't have the experience. Can we go back to ConTeXt and LaTeX joining forces? And I think the issue the original poster on Tech.Stack Exchange was focused on was the tagging of PDF and producing high quality outputs. Both of them use a tech-like syntax for input, and I actually don't know how ConTeXt does what it does. That's something I should probably learn about. But what struck me was, first of all, what overlap is there between Tech and ConTeXt? And TIX, the diagram drawing software, seemed to be a good example where apparently TIX works with both LaTeX and ConTeXt, and I expect it also works with plain Tech as well. So the commonality is quite important. And then the other thing is AMS math, which works both with LaTeX and web pages via MathJax, which is, I think, tremendously important. And the question that puzzles me is, well, it's not so much puzzles me. If a math book is being typeset by ConTeXt in Holland and it's got mathematics in it and it's for secondary school students, to get accessible outputs, one really wants to leverage MathJax, and so one really wants to be able to use the AMS math material in it. And as I recall, AMS math is a LaTeX package that evolved out of a separate system that I think was prior or adjacent to LaTeX called AMS Tech. I've got the manual for it downstairs somewhere. So I see the AMS math as being a vital component for any STEM typesetting system that supports accessibility. And I'm thinking it would be quite helpful if, I don't know how difficult it would be, to at least explore refactoring so that AMS math can work in a standalone manner. And I would like that to be, like TIX, something that's available for any tech-based or tech-like typesetting system. So I'll stop at that point because I floated an idea. And perhaps David or Kelly would like to come in on this.
What I'd like is what I would like, am I muted? I'd like there to be a whole lot more defaults in LaTeX. So the fact that begin theorem, end theorem doesn't come by default, that all the symbols in the AMS math symbol aren't there. I think that's the proliferation of packages in LaTeX is not a good thing, especially since half of them are incompatible with the other path. So yeah, I would like to see the AMS symbols and all these standard environments kind of there by default, so that 90% of users don't need to worry about packages at all.
Now, am I right in thinking that in PreTeXt, the user doesn't know that there's LaTeX in the back end and certainly doesn't know what packages are being loaded?
So if you want PDF from PreTeXt, it produces LaTeX, and then that LaTeX produces the PDF. And we do not allow people to just decide to use a LaTeX package. So whenever we use a LaTeX package, we've checked that it's not conflicting with any of the other packages we already use. And when we need a new feature that seems to require a LaTeX package for PDF, not infrequently, there's more than one package that can do it, and we try to find out which one won't conflict. Sometimes, of course, it matters what order you read in the packages. Yeah, so we try to protect the user from worrying about packages, and definitely protect them from the incompatibility between different packages.
So this sort of reminds me of Chromebooks. I quite like Chromebooks, which run Linux underneath, and for that matter, mobile phones run Linux underneath. But the user of a Chromebook doesn't have to do any system administration. It doesn't have to download packages and configure all sorts of stuff. That's all managed for them. And with PreTeXt, you're wanting to provide a sort of standard environment that allows people to get on and do their job.
Right. So, I mean, if you want to put a theorem in a book or paper, well, then there's theorem tags in PreTeXt. And, you know, what LaTeX package makes that theorem thing, you know, look in a certain way, you know, is hidden from you on purpose. You can say, you know, I want my theorems in a blue box. And I forget, I'm drawing a blank on the name, but there is a LaTeX package that's used for that. But you don't need to know that. There's many ways to draw a blue box around a theorem, but many of those ways are incompatible with other things you want to do in the same document. T-color box, that's the one.
I'm gonna pull out something from my previous work, my work at the Open University before I retired there. It's very easy to put things in boxes as long as you don't have a page break inside a box. The page break is the one thing that's difficult to put inside a box. And a chap called Donald Arsenault produced a wonderful package that manages a lot of the problems there. And I'm going to see if I can't find an example somewhere.
Is that part of why HTML is so much easier to make it accessible, is because you don't have to deal with page breaks?
That's right. A page is a logical unit rather than a, so to speak, physical unit. So I'm trying to find a, here we go. So can you see this? You don't have to read it, but see it's a boxed environment that's going over from one page to another.
It's not uncommon.
Yeah, this has been done with tech. It's something I did at the Open University. It's the one thing I'm really proud of and pleased about that. It's the thing I'm most pleased about that. And that's an example of trying to protect the author from the typography. And I think we've got a long way to go before that sort of separation can take place. And in a sense, it will probably come about through systems such as PreTeXt requiring improved typography. The other way is systems such as LaTeX as it is, which provides good typography but poor XML, requiring better XML. Somehow I think that you have to get the XML right first, and then you have to do the typography. It's a bit like accessibility. You have to get accessibility first, and then you have to do the other stuff. And it's also like security. You can't add security afterwards. You have to design it in. And I suspect that ConTeXt has an advantage over LaTeX. This is just surmising. I don't really have any concrete evidence, because it was designed with XML outputs in mind from the very beginning. So ConTeXt is a tech-like XML, a tech-like markup language that seems to produce both PDF and XML out. And once you've got that, so to speak, refactoring the XML back into the PDF so that you get tagged PDF doesn't seem to be too hard. Whereas LaTeX was always, I think, sort of somewhat accidental in terms of its outputting of HTML or XML. We had Bruce Miller from the MathML, the
NIST.
What is it called again?
He works at NIST and he's in the MathML working group.
Yeah, he has a tool that converts tech to HTML with MathML, and I can't remember what it's called.
LaTeX ML.
LaTeX ML, that's it. So LaTeX ML seems to be adding on to LaTeX something that is hard to add on and easier if you do it first.
So LaTeX ML, so there's, okay, Word is XML. So being XML does not actually mean you're structured or you can do anything with it. LaTeX ML, I mean, a decision they made, which I wouldn't have if I was involved, is they try to preserve all of the author's intent and typesetting choices. And so that really complicates things for them. And PreTeXt doesn't do that. So in PreTeXt, we talk about which hat are you wearing. So you wear your author hat when you're writing, and then the publisher decides later what the styling should be. Like, do you want blue boxes around your theorems? Now, the same genetic person may be both the author and the publisher, but you're not both at the same time. You're wearing your author hat, and then once you have something you're ready to send to your publisher, you can have another person be your publisher, or you could put on your publisher hat. But wearing multiple hats just causes you a headache, and you shouldn't do it.
What does the author actually produce? What does it look like?
Okay, so it's XML, but you could parse it if you know LaTeX. So instead of begin theorem, end theorem, it's theorem and angle brackets, and then slash theorem and angle brackets.
But the author is not typing angle bracket, theorem, angle bracket, some text, angle bracket, slash.
The author could do that, but if the author's in an editing environment that's aware of XML and aware of PreTeXt, then the authors may be typing theorem, and then they type the first couple letters, and then the theorem begin and end tags end, and their cursor's inside the theorem. So you have to type something to indicate that you're running to write a theorem, but you know, I know like for Emacs and VS Code and Sublime Text, there's plugins that are aware
Okay.
of what tags can go in a specific spot. So you're not typing the complete opening and closing tags, and it's preventing you from making invalid pretext as you go along.
Mhm.
I mean, it is a little annoying to have to type P tags around each paragraph, but one of the things that we're working on, particularly I'm working on, is how to make it easier to author that. So I have an environment where you just leave a blank line like you do in LaTeX or Tech to indicate a paragraph break.
You sort of got forces pushing in different directions. The author just wants to bang out the stuff as quickly as possible, but the PreTeXt system that produces the wonderful outputs has got standards to.
Yeah, and I'm convinced we can have it both ways. But my ability to design a user interface and my ability to code the back end are only going to get us to the proof of concept prototype stage. And we're in search of funding to hire competent people to do this work.
So we've had a pretty good discussion, I think, and we've set the context, if you like, that's a bit broader than, oh, well, there's Frank Mittelbach in this corner and Hans Hagen in this corner, and they do this and they do that. And we've got a focus or discussion related to accessibility beyond that of tagged PDF and including Braille. So let's try and get back to the ConTeXt, LaTeX joining forces sort of issue. Well, in a certain sense, you've got different audiences. You've got the people that submit articles to the archive. That's one audience. And the people who are writing college math books, which have got big overlap. So you've got the sort of STEM academics. That's one audience. Another audience is the book publishers in Holland and the other people that use ConTeXt as a typesetting system for publishing, if you like. And ConTeXt is much better in supporting color, I think, and those sorts of things than LaTeX is. So the analogy that's coming to my mind is that you've got all manners of open source operating systems and even closed source operating systems, but they share a lot of resources. So the GNU tools work on all platforms, and they work on the Windows platform as well when you've got the Linux subsystem for Windows. And whether you're one of the versions of BSD or Linux or Unix, you have all these tools available. So you have this sort of shared commonality. And I think what bothers me with LaTeX and ConTeXt is that there's not that much commonality between them. And the commonality that is in existence between them isn't valued and celebrated. So what I've got in my mind, and that's just because where I am and the sort of prejudices and interests I have, is refactoring so that AMS math can work in a standalone manner without assuming that it's working within a LaTeX document. And if you do that and you use I mean, one of the things I'd like to see is people being able to open their web browser and type AMS math. And it really is AMS math, and it really typesets the same way as LaTeX would typeset it. But I don't want them to have to run the whole of LaTeX inside their web browser. I just want them to run that particular part of the mathematics. And I see that as being perhaps a vital part for what David wants to do, which is to make it easier to process small documents using PreTeXt. So in the sense that you have a web front end that allows you to put the math in and allows you to do the text, and it's a simple document, and then it goes off to the server for all the processing. But because it's a STEM document, the people will want to be able to write their equations. So that might be for an exam, for example. An exam is a small document that has to be accessible if you've got blind students taking the exam. So that's my attempt to broaden the discussion and then bring it back to the LaTeX context question that was raised on Stack Exchange. And over to David if he wants to say something. I hope he does.
Well, I think that confuses me, and I guess I didn't appreciate it until you said it earlier, that ConTeXt is good at tagging the PDF. But then Kelly said that she makes PDF that are more accessible, and you mentioned both Markdown and LaTeX. But my understanding is that LaTeX is terrible at making accessible PDFs. So I don't quite understand what is ConTeXt doing and what is Kelly doing to get these PDFs that are more accessible.
Over to you, Kelly, if you can answer that.
One of the major things before was that none of the figures had alternative text. And so just that knowledge that all figures need alternative text and being able to put that in an automated way was a major hurdle for us to get accessible documents. The second part was the ordering of content, so making it where stuff was read in a logical order. And the trouble is that not all of these things are actually LaTeX orientated. So my knowledge that of screen reader, if you have the acronym for the United States, if you don't use full stops, it's read as us, not the US. That has nothing to do with LaTeX. That has to do with me being knowledgeable about the problem and putting in the correct letters and symbols. And so some of it doesn't have to do with it at all and would have been the same whether we were using Word or R Markdown. But I would say the biggest thing for us was using R Markdown and allowing the alternative text to actually be ported to the figure.
So it's more of an R Markdown thing than a LaTeX thing that's enabling you to make these PDFs that are more accessible.
Well, I mean, it all goes back to, like, we can specify which engine is being used to render. And this is where, like, I probably have a mix of words because all, like you said, all of this stuff can be hidden. And then the user doesn't have to be super knowledgeable about it. And so it's been a while since I've gone into the guts of what I did, but I do remember that we had to specify a certain engine, and not all of them were allowed you to create an accessible PDF. And so that was like one step. Say if somebody else does my job, like, that sits right next to me, that was knowledge that I had to gain on my own, how to set the, which engine we were using behind the scenes. And then everybody else on my team was just able to use that code without ever knowing what I did. But to them, it seemed like, oh, I just typed like normal. And then, this alternative text can go through and then be inside my PDF, but they didn't actually know what they were doing.
It sounds to me, Kelly, like you've been working on the same problem as you've been working in a problem that's similar to what David is starting to work on, which is making it easier for people to write this stuff without knowing XML or anything else like that. I don't know if you agree with that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
Just in a
so
different
that's a nice,
framework.
yeah, and in the framework of R. So R has got its own community, and there's some people there that have done tremendously good work. I'd like to mention Jonathan Godfrey again. As I recall, he was saying that you see, he sometimes needs to create PDF. Perhaps there's a student that requires PDF, or he needs to write publication, and so he needs to proofread what he writes. We all need to, but he's blind, and he proofreads the HTML. He proofreads the HTML, and that way he can check he's got properly expressed what it is that he's got to express. And I hope, well, let's say hypothetically, he takes the view that if I've proofreaded it in HTML and it's come out correctly, if my proofreading finds no mistakes, and there's a mistake in the PDF, that's a problem in the system. It's not my mistake. It's a bug in the system. Certainly if your PDF comes out correctly, but the HTML is garbled, and you haven't been told that you've made a mistake, then there's an error in the system. One of the early phrases of computing is garbage in, garbage out, which means that if your input isn't good, then your output can't be relied upon. And a system that doesn't have a garbage detector at the front end is always going to be painful. It's like having no quality control when you're doing a manufacturing process. And David, through PreTeXt, is having that quality control, but it puts a burden on the authors that he's seeking to remove. I'll stop at that point and let David come in, or Kelly.
I have a question for David. So the burden that you're putting on the author of basically needing to tag, say, the paragraph or the section, I think some of that can be done with a filter, although they have to be quite smart. I think the problem, at least that I've dealt with the people that are trying to do it in the LaTeX kernel, is backwards compatibility. And so I'm not really sure, like, when you start something new, then you're able to basically not have backwards compatibility. But how helpful is, like, how much do we have to work on making things the exact same versus moving forward and producing something that's more accessible to a greater number of people because it has this accessibility, but it might have a different font. You know what I mean? Like, it just seems like there's so many different problems without putting priorities on each one of them in a global way, that we're kind of just circling around and not getting very far.
So about half the books in PreTeXt
We missed you.
once,
Can you go back to the beginning, because we missed you?
about half the books in PreTeXt were once in LaTeX. And so I have this complicated script that attempts to convert. Now, it's not possible. Okay, even perfect LaTeX can't necessarily convert to perfect PreTeXt. Like, for example, in LaTeX, there's no end of section tag. There's no end of subsection tag. I mean, in LaTeX, you could put a subsection inside a section with no intervening subsection, and it doesn't complain. And of course, that's not valid when you get into XML. But yeah, so certainly 90% of what you typically write, you can mostly infer just by writing in a LaTeX type way. So I've sort of lost track of what question I'm answering. Yeah, so having to type the tags, that is not a burden in reality if you use a good text editor. Okay, most people don't even understand what a good text editor is, but once they do, then you can intuit most of the structure, like section, subsection, subsection. You know, a theorem can go almost anywhere. An answer can only appear inside an exercise. So if you have an exercise and you want to supply the answer, that answer needs to be physically inside the exercise. Otherwise, you don't know what it's the answer to. Okay, but that kind of makes sense. And the more rapid feedback you can give the author about, oh no, there's a problem, it's not looking right, the better. So that's one of the many things we're trying to do. And you could be in VS Code and have an instant preview of the HTML next to you. And this is finally circling back to Jonathan's question. Producing HTML from input is way, way easier than producing PDF. So you can sort of emulate most of what's going on to make the HTML, but how to have AMS tech without the tech full backend to get PDF, I don't see that that's going to be so easy. So I like HTML for lots of reasons. One, it's easier to create. It has much more interactivity and functionality, and it's way easier to make be accessible. And that's certainly the attraction of PreTeXt. And for people who want a way to read offline, you produce Epub from PreTeXt, which doesn't have interactivity, but neither does PDF. So PDF is really intended for print, and we don't want people reading PDF on their devices when they could read Epub. And I think our EPUB
Can you give a
conversion
definition of what EPUB is? I don't know. I have not been exposed to it.
It's a document format. Okay, Kindle. Kindle is a form of EPUB. So if you want to read on your Kindle device, you create a something like an EPUB file or set of files. Yeah, so those little devices where you read a book in your little tablet, it's usually EPUB that you're reading.
So that's different than a PDF. Like
Yes.
You're not reading a PDF, you're reading some other kind of document.
Yes, and so it reflows and lets you change the font and stuff like that in a way that isn't easy in PDF.
And EPUB denotes that it's in a public or open format, so essentially anyone could write that, and it's basically a zip file, and when you unzip it, you find the text, which is text, and like you said, it's reformatted, reflowed, and at least some of the ebook readers actually use the tech hyphenation patterns and so on, but they can, if you resize the text on the screen, they can reflow it. I mean, processors are so fast now, they can just reformat it on the fly. Yeah, whereas tech uses the same hyphenation patterns, but of course you process the whole document until you get it. And
if you download a website, either through saving this page through the browser or using I think it's wget, and zip it all up, that's fairly close to what EPUB is. So it's like a web page, except it doesn't have any web access.
Yeah, in some sense, yeah.
Everything you need is contained in this zip file. All the fonts, all the JavaScript. So you can put math jacks into EPUB. So it's a repackaging of web pages. That's the way I think of it.
In fact, I just bought an EPUB today, as a matter of fact, and might have heard of Project Gutenberg, which has digitized sort of out of copyright stuff. They have a lot of stuff available in EPUB. You can just download it and read it on a dedicated ebook reader. But the one I had, unfortunately, physically broke, and also the environment I was using, their cloud backup didn't work. So I'm looking to find another one, but I can also read them on my iPad, for example. So it's a device independent thing. The advantage of an ebook reader is that it uses practically no electricity, and it's great for reading on the beach because you have a a sort of so-called e-ink screen as opposed to an illuminated display. So it really does look like a printed book. It's very, very, very convenient. So I really, I'm a big fan of Epub stuff. And this, you know, like I say, essentially all of Project Gutenberg has converted the stuff to Epub now. And it's, I read a Dickens novel recently and I didn't even notice any typos. So it's really well done.
The another big difference is that PDF readers are usually supplied by Adobe, whereas Epub readers are supplied by all manner of people.
Yeah.
And as it happens, I think that means that Epub gives you a more accessible output. It certainly gives you more opportunities for fixing the thing if it's broken. I'm thinking ahead of the annual meeting, which is partly online, if not wholly online, of the Tech Users Group in July. And I think improving LaTeX accessibility is something I'd like to talk about. And this discussion here has been enormously valuable for that. And perhaps David or somebody else from PreTeXt would also like to do a contribution to accessibility to go into that same track.
Well, we're,
You don't have to answer now.
yeah, well, I mean, in PreTeXt, we're definitely thinking of the HTML.
I missed you.
Yeah, that we're thinking that the HTML is how we're producing accessible content. And if the LaTeX people, you know, do come up with a way of making accessible PDFs, then we'll use it. But that seems to be a long time coming. And we're definitely see the HTML as a way of making accessibility pretty more quickly.
So your focus is on accessibility. Your focus is on solving people's problems, if you like. And HTML allows you to do that. And when LaTeX comes along and can help you, you'll use it. But you don't want students to have to wait for that.
I mean, I like LaTeX and it's a great project, but I'm just not at all optimistic that accessible PDFs are going to come along in the usable future, you know, as I see it.
And if your documents have been written in PreTeXt, then you've only got one conversion problem in terms of creating accessible PDF from LaTeX. So if the LaTeX needs to be changed, if you need to generate different LaTeX to get the accessible PDFs out, you've essentially got one conversion problem rather than one problem per document.
Yeah, no, well, definitely, if the LaTeX we need to produce has to be different to get accessible PDFs, we'll absolutely do that.
I'm going to give Kelly another chance to talk, and then perhaps those people that want to go can go, because we've gone over time a little bit. And if Philip wants to talk about VMS, that will also be good. So Kelly, do you have any closing words?
No.
Okay. David.
I've said enough.
Yeah, I've said enough too, but it doesn't stop me talking. So, Philip, if you'd like to stay and talk about VMS with me, that would be great. David and Kelly, I thank you very much for coming, and it's been a great discussion. I think it's been really useful. You